Okay, so I want to start off by saying I'm not a professional photographer, I'm a chef, and that's where my expertise lies, in the kitchen. But photography does have a significant part to play in my professional work. I've photographed my own cookbook, I've had to photograph products I've designed for sale, recipes for magazines and newspapers, and of course my dishes for social media and YouTube. Over the years, I had to find my own way with food photography because I never had a budget to have professional photographs done. So to start out, I bought myself some really cheap gear, I learnt some of the basics, and then hopefully over the years I've improved and learnt some things that might be useful to people starting out themselves now too. So I definitely don't think that I'm an expert, and I hope that I'm going to continue to improve and evolve. But if you like some of the style of my food images, in this video I'm going to give you 5 tips that I hope will help you to achieve something similar. These will work for both your camera or just a phone. Of course, you're going to get better quality images if you're shooting with an SLR, but whatever you're using, these should help you to just improve your food photography. So I'll go through the 5 tips, and then at the end of the video I'll talk you through my current camera setup and give you some recommendations if you're looking to get a first camera and start to step up your photography. Okay, so tip number 1 is lighting. Lighting is probably the most important thing to think about, but I want to keep it fairly simple here, so we'll focus on what I think will be the most useful thing to the largest number of people, which is to try to shoot using natural, diffused light wherever possible. Natural lighting is flattering to food, and it helps you to get natural colours and appealing looking dishes. Generally, I'd suggest avoiding harsh lighting. It tends to be less flattering, particularly that from light bulbs or especially from fluorescent tubes that you sometimes get in kitchens. Because of this, and because it's fairly easy to access, there's no setup costs, and it's fairly simple to work with, I tend to gravitate towards using natural light. But you do still want this natural light to be diffused and not harsh, direct sunlight. The easiest way to do this is to take your photos by a large window where there's ambient light coming through but not direct sunlight shining straight onto the food. And once I have myself set up with that nice soft natural light, I like to generally shoot my photographs into that light or to the side of it. That way the light naturally wraps around the object, which I quite like as a pleasing look. 90% of the time, I would say this is how I'm lighting my food, and it's a particular look and a style that I like. It might not be for everyone, but if you're starting out, this is something I would suggest trying. Of course, you can't always control the situation as much as this. So, for example, if I'm out eating in a restaurant, I don't want to be faffing around with this kind of thing. I don't want to cause a fuss. I want to be out there just enjoying the food. So then I will try to use natural light if I can be by a window. Or if not, I'll look around and see what else there is to use. You know, candlelight can give an interesting look and a little bit of warmth, but I'll use whatever's available with the minimum of fuss. Tip number 2 is a simple tip for composing your images, and that's to shoot through things or to use objects to create some foreground for your images. One of the reasons that I have plants in my images so often is because I like plants, but they can also be a really great way to add depth to your image by adding a little bit of foreground and background. You can use things like tableware, glasses, vases, or houseplants and put them between you and your subject, or just slightly off to the side. You don't have to really have them in the image, they're just creating some abstract shape which kind of fills a little bit of empty space and helps to guide your eye towards your dish, towards your subject of the photo. This is something that I do a lot, and it's something that you'll definitely also see from other people photographing food and drink. Someone that I really like who does this very effectively is Stefan from Track, a brewery that I'm working on a little collaboration with. And you can see in his images how he uses objects to create some foreground, and you have these lovely blurred out backgrounds, which makes the drinks really pop out as the subject, but also gives this very appealing overall look to the images. I love this way of setting up and composing photos because you can do it quite quickly and just use objects that are around you. You're not having to search around for props or overly set things up, and quite often I've just got a moment when a dish is ready and just a free moment out of the kitchen to try and get some photographs of it. And being able to do things like this feels more natural and relatively quick, and a way of just using things in your environment. And that goes for if you're eating out as well. You can see if there's little things like a glass on the table that can help to give a little bit of foreground to photographs you might be taking in a restaurant. Tip number 3 is to think about your choice of lens or your focal length, and this will apply both to cameras and to phones, but just in slightly different ways. I won't get too technical about this because I'm going to give you some gear recommendations and tell you what I use towards the end of the video. But to flatter your food and have it stand out from its background, one of the important factors is what focal length you choose. When you're using a camera, that's determined by what lens you use, but if you're using a phone, it might be determined by which of the phone's cameras you use, if it has more than one, or which setting you use that camera in. Your focal length determines your angle of view, which is how much of your scene is in your image. So a focal length of 35mm or below is going to capture an awful lot of a scene, and so it's quite often good for things like landscapes where you really want to see everything. Then a normal focal length is something closer to what your eye sees, and that'd be around 50mm. And then you have telephoto focal lengths, which are anything from 85 degrees up into the hundreds, and they're going to pull your subject closer to you and give you a narrower view of it. Along with the field of view, our lens is also going to determine how much of the background and foreground we can blur out, and depending on the style that you're going for, that might be an appealing look that you want. Now, usually you don't want a wide-angle lens for food. It can distort the subject and make it look a little bit unnatural, as well as possibly including more of the surroundings than you want if you want that particular subject to really stand out. That might be different for if you are taking pictures of a kitchen and there's some action happening, but generally if you're focusing in on a dish, you probably don't want something that captures as much of that scene. And it's also often appealing to blur out some of that background and foreground, so we lose some of the less important elements of the image. Our subject really stands out and is shown in a nice, flattering way. A great lens for this is a 50mm prime lens with a wide aperture, and the good news is that most camera companies will do a pretty cheap entry-level version of this lens. I photographed my first cookbook entirely with Canon's cheapest SLR and their cheapest 50mm lens, which I got secondhand for £60. Now I use a more expensive professional level 50mm lens and a more modern camera, but this is still the focal length that I go to most of the time, and this is the lens that's usually on my camera. The other lens that I use a lot is a 100mm macro close-up lens, which is great for getting close-up detail. A lot of phones now will have a macro setting, so you can get quite close-up images with them, or you can also get these little magnifiers that you can add on to cheap lenses. So they aren't perfect, but they're a great way to start to get more close-up images if you don't want to invest in a macro lens yet. So as a general rule, when you're setting up to take your photos, you want to pick a lens or a camera setting that's going to give you something like the natural human field of view, or even slightly closer in. And also I'd suggest something that will help you to blur out that background a little bit. If people would like a more advanced video on this stuff in the future, then let me know in the comments, and I can do one where we go more into the exposure triangle and metering and some more advanced techniques. But if you're just starting out, I would suggest using your camera in aperture priority mode, or if you've got a phone that you're using, that might have a food mode, or sometimes portrait mode might give you something similar where you're starting to blur out the backgrounds a little bit. In aperture priority mode on a camera, you want to pick an aperture number somewhere between 1.8 and 2.8, and that's going to give you that lovely blurred, softened foreground and background, and the camera will calculate the rest of the settings for you. So like I say, I'll talk about my camera and lenses and some more specific starter recommendations at the end of the video if that's of interest to you. Tip 4 is to give yourself options by taking multiple images from multiple angles and distances. Since you're taking digital images, there isn't a set limit to the number of pictures that you can take, like there would have been with analog film photography, which I'm going to do a video on, by the way, because I think there's some interesting stuff to talk about with regards to food photography there too. So with digital, you can easily take more images than you need and use different angles and then whittle those down to your favorites later on. It's good to think about your angles and get some variety, not just have everything from the same eye level point of view. So you might want to get down low, get some interesting shots from there, get some from above, try getting some really close in, and then you can look through these later and you might be surprised by what you like the look of. If you're using a phone for this, one thing that can be helpful is to flip the phone upside down so you can more easily get in close and get some low angles of view. There are two exceptions to when I would take multiple images, and that's when I'm in restaurants. And as I've said, that's because I want to be there to enjoy the food and I don't want to impact the atmosphere for anyone else. So then I'll generally try and just take one, maybe two quick pictures of the food, and that'd be it. And then the second is with analog film photography, which is something I find more and more interesting for food photos. So I will do a dedicated video about that, but when you're shooting on film and using vintage cameras, you are limited to a certain number of shots per roll of film, and you have to take a bit more time to get your image correct on a manual focus older camera. So that can be quite a good discipline, and I think it's improving my photography working like that, but obviously that's a case where I'm not going to take lots and lots of multiple images. And then tip 5, the last tip, is to edit your photos, but to be careful not to over edit them. Photos generally need a little bit of editing to make them look their best and as true to life as possible, but it's very easy to veer into over-editing them, and that tends to look a little bit unnatural and a little bit amateurish. I have absolutely done this myself, and people tend to do this more when they're starting out, and in fact now I find that more and more I tend to edit my photos in a subtler and subtler way, sometimes even taking a degree of sharpness and saturation of the colours out to get something that feels as natural as possible. There's lots of different applications and programs you can use to do this, both on your computer or on your phone. I personally use Lightroom, which works both on the computer and on the phone, but you should use whatever suits you and you find easiest and most intuitive. I'll just note here as well that I take all my photos in RAW, which if you don't know what it is, don't worry about it at all. It's something I could go more into in a more advanced photo video. But basically it's a photo format that captures more information in your images, but it results in initially a more flat looking image. So these images require more editing to get them back to true to life, but because you've captured more information, you have quite a bit more leeway in how you edit them. So this is generally the format that professional photographers would use. If you're wanting to get more serious about your photography, then shooting in RAW and learning how to edit those images is definitely a good step towards that. But whatever kind of images you're taking, you're probably going to want to do just some subtle little edits to them. I open up my images in Lightroom, and then the first thing that I do is adjust the exposure. Is the image too bright or too dark? And then I'd maybe want to add a little bit of contrast by generally taking the blacks a little darker and the whites a little lighter. And then I'll have a look at colour. Are the colours natural looking? Are they too saturated? Do they need calming down a little bit? Or could they do with lifting a little bit to make it look more luscious? But this is where you really want to be cautious that you don't overdo it. You can very quickly go to things looking a little bit unnatural if you push this too far. As I say, I'm definitely not perfect at this, and over a period of time, I tend to look back on photos and wish that I'd taken them a bit differently and maybe edited them a bit differently, but generally I'm always moving in that direction of making subtler and subtler changes to images. So my tip really is to edit, but edit gently. Think about most of the work for your image being done in how you light it and how you compose it. So just to finish up, I'll share what I'm currently using and my suggestions if you were looking to just start out with an SLR. So the camera I use is a Canon R6, and the three lenses that I use the most are the Sigma Art 50mm 1.4, the Sigma Art 85mm 1.4, and then Canon's 100mm 2.8 macro lens. The 50mm is the focal length that I talked about earlier, and it is the main one that I use, and really this lens is just a more advanced version of the little cheap 50mm lens that I started out with. The 100mm macro lens is great for anything closer up or anything where I want to bring the background a little closer into my subject. It's really sharp, it gives you great, incredible detail shots. And then lastly, the 85mm lens, which is a beast of a thing, and it's a slightly unusual lens to use for food photography. It's generally considered to be more of a portraiture lens, and it can be a little bit awkward to use for food. It can be hard to get the right distance away from your subject or to use in tighter spaces. But I find that when I can use it, the images that I get from this lens, I just really love. It's got a particular look that I really like, and I like the fact I think that it is a little bit unusual and it's not so often used for food photography. So if you're just starting out and looking to get some equipment, I'd recommend looking at secondhand because you can get some really great deals on lenses and cameras at places like mpb.com or eBay. I'd recommend starting out with an entry-level SLR. I personally like Canon, but there's a bunch of different options and you should go with what feels right to you, what you're most comfortable or familiar with. And then I would look for a second-hand 50mm lens. And with just those, you'd be ready to go and able to get some really great images. And these will be a big step up from taking photos on your phone or on a camera with a zoom lens or a fixed lens. This video has been really focused on the basics, but if there's enough interest, I'll definitely do a video where we can go into a bit more advanced stuff. And let me know in the comments what you're using, what you started out with, and maybe what you would recommend for people beginning themselves, as well as if you've got any tips that you think I've missed out here. I'll have that slightly more niche video on food photography using old analog film cameras and vintage lenses coming at some point, so do subscribe to make sure that you don't miss that. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been helpful and I'll see you soon.